Absolutely. Me too.
My people.
Absolutely. And Gary, something you were sharing with me is that healthy life, the things that people eat, the way that people live their lives can be different for each person, individual, based on their DNA. Is that right?
Yes, based on our DNA. Interestingly, modern medicine has subscribed to a lot of theories to explain pathology and disease that are just not valid. How many of you have heard of genetically inherited thyroid disease? How about genetically inherited hypertension, high blood pressure that runs in families? Or high cholesterol, or high triglycerides, right? Put your hands up if you've heard of any of those genetically inherited diseases. Put your hands up. Okay, so 100% of the room has their hands up right now. So genetically inherited diseases, by definition, are on the genome, right? There's a gene. If it's genetically inherited, it's a gene that's being passed from mother to son, or father to daughter, or father to son, right? Can any of you name the gene that any of those diseases are carried on? Interestingly, I don't know a single physician walking this earth that could do so either. Let that settle in for a second. That means that of the top 5 genetically inherited diseases, even though we know every single gene in the human genome, no one can identify what gene is being passed from generation to generation to pass on disease. And the reason why we can't identify that gene is because those diseases do not exist. So what is it that is being passed on from mother to son, or father to daughter, or father to son, or mother to son? How is it that high blood pressure runs in families? How is it that depression or anxiety runs in families? Or drug and alcohol addiction? Or things like cardiovascular disease, high cholesterol? How do they run in families? And this concept may be the most important concept that you hear in your adult lifetime for why disease develops and runs in certain families. And it is called methylation. What is inherited is the process of methylation. And let me explain the process of methylation. You see, when we take crude oil out of the ground, right? And we all know about crude oil in the Middle East. We take crude oil out of the ground. We can't put crude oil directly into our vehicle. Why? Because crude oil has to go through a process of being refined before the car understands crude oil. It doesn't understand crude oil, it understands gasoline. But I have to take that raw material, crude oil, and I have to refine it into gasoline so I can then put it into my vehicle. If I cannot refine crude oil, then taking all the crude oil out of the ground under the sun does no good for that vehicle to operate. Human beings are no different. We go through a process called methylation. It is the most important process that human beings go through. And this is the process where we take raw material and we break it down into something that our bodies can understand. And every single person in this room has 5 genes in your body that govern this process. There are 5 of them. And they determine what raw materials, what crude oil gets refined into and how it enters a biological transaction in the human body. When one of these 5 genes is broken, then you get what appears to be disease. But we do not pass disease on from generation to generation. Every one of you that's sitting at a table right now next to another person, if that person has cardiovascular disease, no matter how long you sit next to them, you will not catch it. If they have hypertension, no matter how long you sit next to them, you will not catch it. Disease is not transmissible like that. If they had COVID, they could pass COVID on to you, right? They could pass a virus on to you, but we do not pass disease from generation to generation. What you inherited was the inability to refine certain raw materials. And once we understand that, we can fix it. How many of you know somebody that's been affected by, either have you been affected by, or you know somebody that's been depressed, been affected by depression? So the definition of depression, as I alluded to yesterday, is an inadequate supply of serotonin. If you have low levels of the neurotransmitter serotonin, you are depressed. That's by definition what that means. So don't you think if the definition of depression is low serotonin, then the cure should be to raise serotonin? But that's not what we do. Any of your friends that were depressed were probably put on an SSRI, a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. They were actually taking what little serotonin you had or your friend had, and they rationed it. So by definition, it never ended depression. But once we understand that one of these 5 genes controls the manufacture of serotonin. Serotonin, that valuable neurotransmitter, is made in our gut. 90% of the serotonin that pushes off depression is made in our gut. It travels up a nerve called the vagus nerve into the brain and keeps us from being depressed. So generally when we have depression, we have an issue with the gut, not an issue with the brain. Unless you can point to the specific trigger. This is true with anxiety. How many of you have ever experienced anxiety? Or know somebody who's experienced anxiety? Okay. I bet if I asked you these 3 questions about your anxiety, we could prove that it's not coming from your outside environment. Number 1, people that experience anxiety generally have experienced it on and off throughout their entire lifetime. It comes and goes. And number 2, they can't point to the specific trigger that causes it. People that suffer from anxiety can wake up in the morning feeling anxious. They can be riding in a car home from work and they can be overwhelmed with anxiety. They can be sitting in a room like this right now, very safe, surrounded by family, surrounded by friends, and have an overwhelming sense of anxiety. That is not coming from a cluster of symptoms. That's coming from the process of methylation. The same is true in the gut. I bet 70% of all of the allergies that we believe we have are not actually allergies at all. They are a simple breakdown in methylation that does not allow the body to absorb certain raw materials. By the way, is this making sense to any of you guys?
Yeah.
All right, great. So I don't even remember your question. I'm down another rabbit hole, and I apologize for that. But that's my answer.
It's all good, man, because you're excited. You're a wealth of knowledge, that's for sure.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And you mentioned serotonin and it being low, that regulates your mood, positivity, right?
Yes.
Your attitude maybe could help with that.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's true.
So if someone has low serotonin, how can they actually get it up higher and consistently so that they can have a better chance of having great attitude, having a positive mood, being energetic during the day?
Yeah, so interestingly, once we understand that this process of methylation is something that we can fix, this is the exciting thing, right? Modern medicine doesn't want the answer to be so easy, but it is. Because human beings were meant to thrive. God wants us to thrive. We are supposed to be wealthy, we are supposed to be healthy, we are supposed to be strong, we're supposed to be happy. We are meant to thrive. There's nothing wrong with thriving. And what happens is, when this process of methylation is broken down, generally it is an absence of very simple raw materials. The breakdown of B vitamins, vitamin D3, and something called amino acids is so important to your mood, to your emotional state, to your gut health, to your mental health, to things like ADD and ADHD, that we don't want to solve them by putting healthy raw materials back into the human body. We want to solve them by bringing pharmaceuticals in. So for example, ADD or ADHD. How many of you have heard of those or suffered from them or know someone who suffered from them? I suffer from them. You just saw me go down an ADHD rabbit hole a minute ago. You're seeing it live. So these issues, these disorders, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or attention deficit disorder, what is that? Right? What really is ADD? Well, it's an inability to quiet the mind. And how does our mind quiet? You see, every thought that you have was created in your brain by a collection of neurotransmitters getting together and creating a thought. But did you know that you not only create thought, you also degrade thought? And ADHD is an ability to create thoughts, but a slow process of breaking them down. It is the absence of an important amino acid called L-methionine. L-methionine. A precious metal called zinc, and another precious metal called, a light metal called magnesium. Deficiencies in magnesium, zinc, and L-methionine don't allow the brain to break down thought. So what happens when you can't break down thought? Well, you start stacking thoughts up. I always use the example that imagine yourself sitting in the theater, by yourself, and there's a stage in front of you. And every time you have a thought, it's like a person walking to that edge of that stage and engaging you in a dialogue. But only when you're done with that thought, it should exit the stage. And people that have ADD or ADHD, they have a problem degrading that thought. They have a problem having that person exit the stage. So a second person comes up, and then a third, and then a fourth. So you don't actually have ADHD. You don't have attention deficit disorder. You have attention overload disorder. You are paying attention to too many things. People with ADHD, and I know because I suffer from it, I used the example last night, will be thinking about taking a vacation when their friend walks up. When they're thinking about taking a vacation, their friend walks up, now they're talking to their friend thinking about a vacation. And they look at a logo on their friend's jacket, and now they're thinking about a vacation they want to take. Thinking about a vacation they took. And the dialogue they're trying to engage their friend in is broken and degraded because there's so many other windows open. As soon as you put the raw material into the human body to quiet the mind, that eviscerates. You know, sadly, in the United States, we have something called folic acid. In 1993, our federal government decided that all of our grain supply, all pastas, all white flour, all white rice, all white bread would be sprayed with folic acid, a synthetic ingredient that is not known in nature. Folate is known in nature. When you put folic acid into a 6-year-old, it is like cocaine for a 6-year-old child. It makes their brain race and ricochet off the walls. And what do we feed our kids before they leave for the school in the morning? Breakfast cereal, fortified or enriched with folic acid. If you ever see those terms, turn them around. We feed them, sugar and folic acid. Their little bodies can't process folic acid, so now they get off to school, and then the teacher calls and says, "Hey, little Sammy, he can't pay attention. He's disruptive. He can't finish his tasks. We got to bring in the Ritalin, right? We got to bring in the pharmaceuticals to calm this child down." Well, if you just took the folic acid out of his diet, gave him the folate that his methylation process needs, you'd see normal behavior in those children. And I wish modern medicine would go on the search for the missing raw material instead of the search for the pharmaceutical answer. Because as we put the right raw material back into the human body, disease eviscerates. And there's not a single disease, in fact, I'm happy to take questions, that you can point out to me where I cannot trace it back to the missing raw material that led to that disease process. Right? All cancer has two things in common. It begins in a hypoxic environment. You have to have low oxygen. And the second thing that you need is DNA replication, run amok. Replication of DNA is governed by this process of methylation. You can do a test. You can take a cheek swab your cheek, look at these 5 genes, these 5 actionable genes, and fix them so that you don't have to deal with any of those diseases or any of that pathology. Thank you.
That's absolutely incredible. And I love Sammy. He's a good kid.
Yes, Sammy's he's disruptive and he needs Ritalin. Yes, ma'am.
My mind was blown by the amount of information you're sharing, especially about the amount of thoughts you get when you have ADHD. And the definition you said, I've never thought about it, but I think I have something similar to that. Like my mind always have so many ideas and stuff. Mm-hmm. And one lady one time told me that, and I was really upset. I said, "You cannot just give me and decide that for me." And I've never went and checked actually. But when you're talking about it now, I want to know more about the case and what to do about that. Because I always have in my brain so many thousands of ideas comes and yeah.
So if you have, and I'm just going to single you out for a minute because if you are experiencing this, there's other people in the room that are experiencing it.
Yeah.
So if you have a lot of thoughts that are entering your mind and,
Yes.
and someone has told you you have ADD or ADHD, then you very likely have one of 2 types of sleep patterns.
Yeah.
Either you go to bed tired and you have a hard time falling asleep because your mind keeps you awake.
Yeah, sometimes.
Or you fall asleep and you have a hard time maintaining sleep, staying asleep, because your mind wakes you up. And what are the things that you think about when you should be sleeping, like when you should be falling asleep, or when you wake up at night? They're really small, what I call innocuous thoughts. They're not the things that deserve to keep you up at night, right? It's not like loss of a loved one. They're little things like, did I return that email? You know, does my belt match my shoes? Did I get everything on my grocery list today? They're little thoughts that, like, you're laying there at 2:30 in the morning going, why on earth am I thinking about Instagram at 2:30 in the morning, right? Why am I thinking about how low the milk is in the refrigerator at 2:30 in the morning? I can't do anything about it. This is because as your environment quiets, your mind wakes up.
Yeah.
And so if we can't quiet the mind, then the mind is active when the body is quiet, and this is why it interrupts your sleep pattern. And generally, those people also experience mild anxiety, mild levels of anxiety, because it's carried on the same gene, right? If you can't methylate certain nutrients, the outcomes are very, very predictable. In fact, we develop our personality around our genes. I will promise you this: if you have ADD or ADHD, or have ever been told you have ADD or ADHD, you have the type of sleep pattern that I just mentioned, and you suffer from mild anxiety, then the personality that you have is called consummate overachiever profile. This is somebody who is very hard on themselves, right? They set a very high bar for themselves. I think we have one here in the front row, Miriam. And this is, by the way, not a bad thing, right? You set a very high bar for yourself. So you judge the success or lack thereof of your day by how many things you get done on a task list you create for yourself.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the day, you evaluate it and you go, well, I got 9 of the 10 things done. But because I didn't get the 10th thing done, it was a failure. And I didn't get anything done today. You probably got 9 times done more than anyone else in your peer group. But yet you still feel inadequate at the end of the day because you didn't meet your own task list. Sounding familiar, right? I see a lot of smiles out there, right? Yeah, this is why, like sometimes I sit and I'll put people on a stage like this and I'll tell them more about themselves. I sound like a fortune teller because we develop our personality around our genes. And then those same people, what we do is we impart that same characteristic onto other people. And we find ourselves very easily disappointed in other people because we feel like they just can't do the basics. Because what comes easy to us doesn't come easy to them. And this cycle goes on and on and on throughout our lifetime. Hard on ourselves, hard on other people. Strained relationships because of expectations that are not being met. Expectations we set for ourselves that are not being met. We don't need any outside motivation. We motivate ourselves. We are motivated to exercise because we have an image of how we should look. We are motivated to succeed because we have an image of socioeconomically where we should be. This is called consummate overachiever profile, and it's in our genes. We develop it from our genes. And it's not that we need to fix that. That's a fine profile to have. But what we want to fix is the lack of sleep and the anxiousness and the anxiety and sometimes the gut issues that go with that.
Gary, can I add something? Especially about the sleep. Sometimes I remember after a big conference or something like the next or any event I attend, I don't sleep for a week or something. Yeah, I feel like excited, not anxious. I feel like more energy flow into my brain, and basically I don't get sleep.
Yes.
I cannot sleep.
This is very true. So the human body, we use resources, right?
Yeah.
So the brain uses resources just like a vehicle, just like a car engine, right? So when you're at a conference like this and you're paying attention, for somebody that has ADHD, you're paying attention to my talk right now, and you're interested, so you're engaged and you're learning. So your brain is hyper excited.
Yes.
You have a deficit in something called L-methionine to start with. By the end of this conference, you will be so depleted in L-methionine that it will take days for it to build back up from your diet. So you can just get back and fix that. That's a fine profile to have. But what we want to fix is the lack of sleep and the anxiousness and the anxiety and sometimes the gut issues that go with that.
Gary, can I add something? Especially about the sleep. Sometimes I remember after a big conference or something like the next or any event I attend, I don't sleep for a week or something. Yeah, I feel like excited, not anxious. I feel like more energy flow into my brain, and basically I don't get sleep.
Yes.
Like I cannot sleep.
This is very true. So the human body, we use resources, right?
Yeah.
So the brain uses resources just like a vehicle, just like a car engine, right? So when you're at a conference like this and you're paying attention, for somebody that has ADHD, you're paying attention to my talk right now. And you're interested, so you're engaged and you're learning. So your brain is hyper excited.
Yes.
You have a deficit in something called L-methionine to start with. By the end of this conference, you will be so depleted in L-methionine that it will take days for it to build back up from your diet. So you can just get back to the normal HFR. It stands for methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase, which you don't need to know. It's important to me that you know I'm smart, so I say that. But so MTHFR is the gene that all this gene does is convert folic acid into something called methylfolate. Crude oil into gasoline. Doesn't sound like a big deal, right? All it's doing is converting folic acid into methylfolate, crude oil into gasoline. But without methylfolate, we can't start the process of methylation. It is the single most important gene in the human body. It's the earliest in the stage of methylation. So you can take some supplement called 5-MTHF, 5-methylfolate. If you have anxiousness, anxiety, gut issues, poor sleep, or racing thoughts, or ADHD, almost everyone that has those conditions can take 5-methylfolate, harmless. 5-MTHF. 5-methylfolate. See, how many of you have heard of postpartum depression?
Yeah.
You know what the leading cause of postpartum depression is? Does anyone know? The prenatal vitamin. 44% of the female population has that gene mutation, which means that 44% of the women in this room cannot methylate folic acid. Yet what are you told to take when you're pregnant with a child? Folic acid.
Yeah.
You're told to take folic acid to prevent neural tube defects. Folic acid doesn't prevent anything. 5-methylfolate prevents neural tube defects. It's like being told to put crude oil in your gas tank. That will not help the engine run. It has to be methylated into gasoline. Folic acid has to be methylated into methylfolate. If you can't do that, which 44% of the women in this room cannot do, then folic acid will skyrocket. And folate will plummet. And this leads to postpartum depression, which is why most women that get depressed after pregnancy finally stop taking the prenatal vitamin and the symptoms go away. So they blame it on the pregnancy, not on the vitamin.
Wow.
This is how significant this issue is, right? The other the other percentage of women, the other 56% are fine, right? They have never, ever, there's not a single published clinical study on the face of this earth that's been peer-reviewed that links female hormones to postpartum depression. Yet we link pregnancy to postpartum depression because we don't understand that it's a simple lack of raw material. We don't teach physicians that the body needs raw material to operate properly. It breaks down because it's not getting what it needs, not because it's diseased. There's nothing that's happened to it. You know, I always use the simple analogy. If I asked you to make me a chocolate chip cookie, right? But I didn't give you brown sugar, and I didn't give you chocolate chips. There is nothing wrong with you. You just lack the raw material to complete the task. The human body is no different. We ask it to make certain recipes, but we don't give it the raw material to complete the recipe. And then we say, that's pathology, that's disease, there's something wrong with you. You need antidepressants. Whereas if I just gave you brown sugar and I gave you chocolate chips, boom, voila, you make a cookie, right? Because there's nothing wrong with it. You just need the raw material. So the human body is no different. When we give it the raw material it needs, it functions like the beautiful machine that God designed it. So I wish that more of the educational system and medical education was about how do we find the missing raw material in the human body rather than search for disease. And that's my answer. Yes, ma'am.
You know, I always like interviewing people who they've had the conversation thousands and thousands of times, and they know what the next question is. Like, so you answer them before anybody can really ask them, or before I can ask them. So I love that. And I know we're getting a little bit close on time right here.
Oh, okay.
So I just want to ask you, please.
Yeah, a great way to contact me is through Instagram, at Gary Brecka. Oh, click on my URL code. I have my own URL code. Right? I had my face on a cake, now I have my own URL code. And also Sage, probably better to contact Sage, because I have ADHD. Yeah, I'm going to do just two more. I'll try to be quick. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, my question is, so if we don't need folic acid and we need the metafolate, why are we prescribed folic acid?
Because we don't know, we assume that if we put folic acid, a physician assumes that if they give you folic acid, your body can break it down. But that's the wrong assumption, right? You may be able to break it down and he can't, or she can and she can't. So every human being is different, you know, and so we can't assume that everything we put into the human body gets methylated, gets broken down the way it's meant to. That's a very false assumption. What we should assume is when we see pathology and disease that they're not breaking something down, and we should look for what it is that they're not breaking down rather than what has broken down in them, right? So if I saw a disease process, like if you said I have an allergy, or I have poor sleep, or I have hypertension, or I have cancer, or cancer runs in my family, I would look for the missing raw material that is causing those things to occur. Yes, sir. I wanted to add to your.
As I told you at lunch yesterday, I'll be about all this. So, two very quick ones. When you mentioned the 5-MTHF on the ADHD, so like, what does somebody experience as a result of taking that? Like, if I believe I have ADHD, so how would that change my daily experience of being able to focus?
How would it change your daily experience? I mean, you can just ask Sage. I mean, I cannot get 45 minutes into my day before she knows whether or not I've taken my vitamins. Right? I mean, I take vitamins every day. And she will, they're in the pocket of my suit right now. I'm not even kidding. Because before I leave the house, she's like, put these in your mouth before you leave. Or I become a giant jerk. So it will balance your mood. It will elevate your emotional state. It will make you more attentive. You'll find that it's easier to pay attention. You'll find that you have less sinking spells. It's easier to fall asleep. The motility of your gut returns to normal, which makes things that you think are allergies go away. So these raw materials are really important. You know, right before the break, Joel, can you just? I want to show one thing super fast before we go on the break, and I'll take 30 seconds. Can you put something up on this computer? Okay. So raw materials in the human body matter, and unfortunately, we manufacture a lot of raw materials out of toxic substances. And I'm going to show you one of my favorites. And today, when you leave, I want you to look at all of your supplements or anything you're taking. I want you to search for this ingredient. Can you just go to Google? Or, I'm sorry, yeah, go to Google. I'm going to show you the most common B vitamin in the world and how dangerous this B vitamin is to human beings. Because one of the things that we've done in trying to manufacture supplements is we've tried to make them cheaper, and we've tried to make them more mass-produced. Understand that B12 is one of the most important nutrients in the human body. It's a metal, and we desperately need it to survive. We have to have this metal in our body. Okay, it's the cobalt metal. When we put it in our body, it's called cobalamin. So 3 types of it occur naturally in nature, but the most common form is man-made. If it's going to take too long, I don't want to get into Miriam's time, but maybe you can just throw the Google up there. This will blow your mind, and the reason why I actually show it to you is because nobody believes me when I just say it. Right? Yes, ma'am.
So I have a quick question about folic. So when you have fix everything.
Thank you. So I have a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu incident, and I had to have surgery on my knee. I think it was medial mastectomy or something like that. Now I have like the moving, crunchy, rice
Crackly,
cookie
yep.
smell. So I'm feeling in my knee, and I can't bear weight on steps. Is there a way to? Because I like heels. I don't want.
BPC 157. BPC, write that down. BPC 157. Body protection compound 157. It's a peptide that will heal that.
It's a peptide.
Yep, natural peptide.
And we can get these from you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and we're opening offices here in the Middle East. We're opening 5 in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, 5 in the UAE, 100 in Egypt. So they'll be local for you guys very soon. Okay, so if we can't get there, I don't want to take up any more. Can we do it in the afternoon? Sure. Yeah, I don't have to leave till 3 o'clock. Beautiful. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate your time.